Deana Martin's hands were shaking as she turned the page. It was Christmas Day, 1995, 3 hours after her father's funeral. She was alone in his study on Mountain Drive, surrounded by photos and memories, and the smell of his cologne still lingering in the air. She'd found the leather journal wedged behind a stack of sheet music in his desk drawer. Most of the entries were mundane: song lyrics, dinner reservations, a joke he wanted to remember. But then she reached March 22nd, 1987. 4 pages. Dense, frantic handwriting that didn't look like her father's elegant script. Words crossed out. Entire sentences scratched through so violently the pen had torn the paper. And at the top, underlined 3 times, "I killed him." What Deana read on those pages would explain everything. Why her father walked off stage mid-tour. Why he stopped performing. Why he spent his last 8 years staring at empty chairs in Italian restaurants. The terrible secret Dean Martin had carried alone. The conversation he'd had with his son 3 days before the crash. The warning he'd ignored. The guilt that had slowly, methodically, destroyed him from the inside out. This is the story of what was written in that journal. And it's the story of a father's love turned into a father's unbearable burden. To understand what Dean Martin wrote on those pages, you need to understand the man he became after March 21st, 1987. The world saw Dean Martin withdraw from public life after his son's death. They saw him cancel shows, refuse interviews, retreat into his Beverly Hills fortress. The official story was simple: a grieving father who needed time alone. The entertainment media respected his privacy. His friends protected him. And Dean said nothing. But Deana had lived through it up close. She'd watched her father transform from the king of cool into a ghost. She'd sat with him in hospital waiting rooms when his emphysema flared up. She'd brought him groceries he wouldn't eat. She'd tried to engage him in conversation, only to be met with that hollow, faraway look. The lights on, but nobody home. The world thought Dean was mourning. Deana knew he was drowning. There were signs, if you knew to look for them. The way he'd stop mid-sentence when talking about Dino, as if the words physically hurt to say. The way he'd flinch whenever anyone mentioned flying. The way he'd ask Deana, over and over, "Did I ever tell you about the last time I talked to him?" She'd say, "Yes, Dad, you told me." The phone call on the morning of March 21st. The "I love you." The "I'm proud of you." The goodbye. That became permanent. But what Deana didn't know, what nobody knew, was that wasn't the last conversation. There was another call, 3 days earlier, March 18th, 1987. And what happened during that call had haunted Dean Martin every single day for 8 years until it finally killed him. March 18th, 1987 started like any other Wednesday in Los Angeles. Dean woke up around 10 a.m. in his Beverly Hills home. He made coffee. He read the newspaper. He was 69 years old and mostly retired, but he had a few shows lined up later in the year. Nothing major. Just enough to keep him connected to the life he'd built. At 2:30 p.m., the phone rang. "Hey, Pops." Dean smiled. Dino, his boy, Captain Dean Paul Martin, calling from March Air Force Base. "Hey, Captain. How's the Air Force treating you?" "Same as always. We've got a training exercise scheduled for Saturday. Standard stuff, but the weather looks dicey." Dean was only half listening. He was looking at a golf magazine, thinking about playing around later that week. "The thing is," Dino continued, and his voice carried something Dean would replay in his mind 10,000 times afterward. Hesitation. The forecast is showing a storm system moving into the San Bernardino Mountains. Heavy snow, low visibility. Some of the guys are saying we should push it to next week. "So push it," Dean said absently, still looking at the magazine. "Yeah, but..." Dino paused. "You know how it is. If I'm the one asking to reschedule, it looks like I'm making excuses. Like I'm scared." Now Dean looked up. "Are you scared?" No, it's not that. It's just, Dad, have you ever had a feeling about something? Like you know something's not right, but you can't explain why. Dean Martin had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, around tough guys and gamblers. He'd survived organized crime in Las Vegas. He'd navigated Hollywood for 40 years. He understood instincts. He understood gut feelings. But on March 18th, 1987, at 2:32 p.m., Dean Martin made the worst decision of his life. Dino, you're a fighter pilot. You're trained for bad weather. You've flown in worse conditions than some snow. I know, but listen to me, Dean interrupted. You can't let fear make your decisions. If you start second-guessing yourself every time the weather's not perfect, you're in the wrong line of work. Trust your training. Trust yourself. You'll be fine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Yeah, Dino finally said. Yeah, you're right. I'm probably just overthinking it. That's my boy. Hey, let's play golf when you're back in town next week. I'll let you win. Dino laughed. You never let anyone win, Pops. First time for everything. Love you, kid. Love you too. And that was it. The conversation Dean Martin would rather have died than have had. 2 minutes and 14 seconds that he would dissect and replay and torture himself with for the rest of his life. Because 3 days later, at 1:52 p.m., on March 21st, 1987, Captain Dean Paul Martin's F-4 Phantom jet requested a turn to avoid storm clouds over the San Bernardino Mountains, the same storm system Dino had called about. The same exercise Dino had wanted to postpone, the same instinct Dean had told him to ignore. The jet turned directly into the mountain at over 400 miles per hour, and Dean Martin's son was gone. Now, sitting in his study on Christmas Day 1995, Deana Martin read her father's confession. The journal entry was dated March 22nd, 1987, written sometime in the early morning hours. Dean had been awake for over 24 hours. He just returned from identifying what remained of his son. His handwriting was barely legible. The entry started simply, I killed him. Then, crossed out and rewritten. I killed my boy. He called me. He knew something was wrong. He told me he wanted to wait, and I told him not to be afraid. I told him fear was weakness. I told him to trust himself and fly. Deanna's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and kept reading. He had an instinct. Pilots are supposed to trust their instincts. That's what keeps them alive. But I took that away from him. I made him doubt himself. I made him think he was being weak for listening to that voice that was trying to save his life. What kind of father does that? The next paragraph was scratched through so many times Deana could barely make it out. All my life, I played it cool. Never let them see you sweat. Never show fear. Never back down. And I taught my son the same thing. Be tough. Be strong. Don't let anyone see you hesitate. And now he's dead. Because he was trying to be like me. There were tear stains on the page. Round, water-damaged circles where the ink had run. I keep thinking about that phone call. The way his voice sounded, he was asking for permission, and I didn't hear it. He was asking me to tell him it was okay to trust himself, and instead I told him to ignore every instinct screaming at him that something was wrong. I told my son to fly into the mountain. Deanna's hands were shaking so badly she had to set the journal down. She'd spent 8 years watching her father disappear into grief. She'd seen him at the funeral, hollow and broken. She'd watched him walk off the reunion tour with Frank and Sammy. She'd brought him dinner and listened to him talk about Dino in that distant, vacant way. She'd held his hand in hospital beds and promised him everything would be okay. But she'd never known this. She'd never known that her father wasn't just mourning. He was carrying a guilt so massive it had crushed him. He wasn't just sad. He was convinced he was responsible, and he'd never told anyone. The journal entry continued for 2 more pages, each paragraph more devastating than the last. They keep telling me it was an accident, bad weather, poor visibility, wrong turn. They have the flight data. They know exactly what happened, but they don't know about the phone call. They don't know that I could have stopped it. One word. Wait. That's all I had to say. Wait until the weather clears. But I didn't. I told him to be brave. I told him not to be afraid. I sent him up there. Jean doesn't know. I can't tell her. How do you tell your ex-wife that you killed your son? How do you say those words out loud? She looks at me with so much grief in her eyes, and all I can think is that her grief is pure. She's mourning him. I'm mourning him and living with knowing I caused it. Deana came by today. She tried to get me to eat. She's a good girl. She wants to help. But how can she help? How can anyone help? The only person who could help me is gone. And I'm the reason he's gone. There was a section where Dean had written, then crossed out, then written again, I should tell someone. Frank would understand. Or maybe Jerry. But every time I try to form the words, I can't. Because saying it out loud makes it real. As long as it stays in my head, maybe it's not true. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it really was just an accident, and the phone call was just a phone call, and nothing I said mattered. But I know the truth. Dino trusted me. He called his father, and his father failed him. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. Dean's handwriting had deteriorated into barely controlled scrawl. I can't perform anymore. How can I stand on a stage and make people laugh when I did this? How can I pretend to be cool when I'm burning up inside? How can I be Dean Martin when Dean Martin killed his son? I'm done. I'm finished. The only reason I'm still here is because I'm too much of a coward to follow him. But I'm not living. I'm just waiting. Waiting for it to be over. Waiting for the day I can see him again and tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I was wrong. Tell him he should have listened to himself instead of me. Maybe he'll forgive me. Maybe God will forgive me. But I'll never forgive myself. The entry ended there. No signature. No closing. Just 4 pages of a father's secret agony. Deana sat in her father's study for 3 hours, holding that journal, crying in a way she hadn't cried at the funeral, because now she understood. She understood why her father had stopped performing. It wasn't just grief. It was guilt. He couldn't be the king of cool anymore because he felt like a murderer. He couldn't entertain people when he believed he'd sent his own son to his death. She understood why he'd walked off the reunion tour. Frank and Sammy had been trying to save him by putting him back on stage. But being on stage wasn't healing for Dean. It was torture. A reminder of who he used to be. A person who deserved to be there. A person who hadn't failed when it mattered most. She understood the empty chairs at restaurants. Her father wasn't just dining alone. He was conducting a conversation with Dino, an apology that would never be heard, a confession that would never be answered. She understood why he'd flinched when she mentioned flying. Every plane in the sky was a reminder of the call, the advice, the instinct he'd overruled. And she understood, with absolute clarity, why her father had seemed so ready to die. He wasn't afraid. He was relieved. Death meant the waiting was over. Death meant he could finally face his son and say the words he'd been rehearsing for 8 years. I'm sorry. I was wrong. It was my fault. But here's what destroyed Deana as she sat there reading. Her father was wrong. The flight data was clear. The crash was caused by spatial disorientation in severe weather conditions. The pilots made a navigation error in 0 visibility. It had nothing to do with whether they should have flown that day. Even if they'd postponed to the following week, they would have been training in similar conditions. It was a tragic accident, a confluence of factors that no one person could have prevented. The phone call hadn't killed Dino. The encouragement hadn't sent him into the mountain. Her father's advice to trust his training and not let fear control him was exactly what any loving parent would say to a son in the military. It was good advice. It was fatherly advice. It was the advice of a man who believed in his son's abilities. But Dean Martin, in his grief and shock, had taken a normal conversation and turned it into evidence of his own guilt. He'd twisted a moment of paternal encouragement into a death sentence. He'd created a crime that didn't exist and spent 8 years in prison for it. And Deana would never be able to tell him the truth. She would never be able to show him the accident reports that proved it wasn't his fault. She would never be able to explain that Dino's instinct wasn't about that specific flight. It was just pre-mission anxiety that every pilot feels. She would never be able to hold her father and tell him, "You didn't kill him. It was an accident. You're not guilty." Her father had died believing he was responsible, and that belief had killed him as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. In the days after Christmas 1995, Deana Martin made a decision. She would keep the journal private. She would never show it to the media. She would never use it for a book or an interview. Her father's pain was his own, and she would protect it. But she would tell the truth about one thing. She would tell people that Dean Martin didn't die of emphysema on Christmas Day. He died of a guilt that was never his to carry. He died of a father's love that turned inward and became self-destruction. He died of words left unsaid and truths that came too late. Years later, when people asked Deana what her father was really like, she would smile and talk about his humor, his warmth, his dedication to family. But sometimes, when the interview was over and the cameras were off, she would add one more thing. "My father taught me something in his death that he couldn't teach me in his life. He taught me that the stories we tell ourselves can be as deadly as any disease. He taught me that guilt, even unearned guilt, can consume a person completely. And he taught me that sometimes the people who seem the strongest are carrying the heaviest burdens in silence." If my father had talked to someone, a friend, a therapist, anyone, maybe they could have helped him see the truth. Maybe they could have convinced him that he wasn't responsible. Maybe he could have lived those last 8 years, actually living instead of just waiting to die. But he didn't. He kept it inside. He wrote it in a journal and hid it in a drawer and let it eat him alive. So if there's anything I want people to take from my father's story, it's this. Talk. Tell someone. Don't carry your guilt alone, especially when that guilt is based on a story that isn't true. Because my father spent 8 years in hell for a crime he didn't commit, and by the time I found the evidence of his innocence, it was too late. The leather journal sits in a safe deposit box now. Deana has read the entry dozens of times over the years. Each time, it breaks her heart in new ways. But there's one detail she always comes back to. On the last page, in the margin, Dean had written something so small she almost missed it the first time. "I love you, Dino. I'm sorry. I hope you're flying free now. I hope wherever you are, you know it wasn't your fault. You were brave. You were perfect. And I failed you." And below that, in different ink, written at some later date, "I'm coming, son. Wait for me. I'll be there soon." Dean Martin kept his promise. On Christmas Day, 1995, 8 years, 9 months, and 4 days after his son died, Dean Martin closed his eyes and let go. He'd served his self-imposed sentence. He'd carried his guilt to the very end. And finally, mercifully, he found his release. Somewhere, in the great beyond, Deana likes to imagine a father and son are together again. And maybe in that place beyond pain and guilt and unanswered questions, Dean Martin finally heard the words he needed to hear. "It's okay, Pops. It wasn't your fault. I forgive you. I never blamed you. Come on, let's play some golf. I'll even let you win." The King of Cool died, believing he was a killer. But he was just a father who loved his son too much. And in the end, that love, twisted by grief into guilt, was the thing that destroyed him. That's the untold tragedy of Dean Martin. Not that he lost his son, but that he lost himself in a story that was never true. And by the time anyone found the truth, it was far too late to save him.